The year is 1945. The world is just emerging from the shadow of the Second World War. Empires are crumbling, and new nations are struggling to be born. In a corner of Southeast Asia, a country called Vietnam, long under French colonial rule, sees its chance for freedom. On September 2nd, in Hanoi's Ba, Dinh Square, a charismatic leader named Ho Chi Minh stands before a massive crowd and declares independence. Quoting the American Declaration of Independence, he proclaims the birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. For a fleeting moment, it seems like a new era of self-determination has dawned. But old empires die hard. France, humiliated by its defeat and occupation during World War II, is desperate to reclaim its former glory and its valuable colonial possessions. French soldiers return to Vietnam, not as liberators, but as conquerors. The dream of a peaceful, independent Vietnam shatters almost as soon as it begins. The First Indochina War erupts in 1946. This isn't just a colonial squabble. It's a brutal, drawn-out conflict. On one side, you have the Viet Minh, a nationalist and communist-led independence movement. They are resourceful, masters of guerrilla warfare, fighting on their home turf for a cause they deeply believe in: freedom from foreign domination. On the other side, the French Far East Expeditionary Corps, a modern, well-equipped army, fighting to hold on to an empire that's slipping through their fingers. Initially, the United States is hesitant. President Roosevelt had been critical of French colonialism. But the world is changing fast. The Iron Curtain is descending across Europe, and the Cold War is beginning. The loss of China to communism in 1949 sends shockwaves through Washington. A new fear takes hold: the domino theory. The belief that if one country in a region falls to communism, the surrounding countries will topple one after another, like a row of dominoes. Vietnam, with its communist-led independence movement, suddenly looks like the first domino in Southeast Asia. So, America's stance shifts. What started as limited, cautious support for France transforms into a massive infusion of aid. By the early 1950s, the United States is bankrolling the French war effort, providing tanks, aircraft, money, and military advisors. American taxpayers are funding up to 80% of the French war costs. The goal is no longer just about helping an old ally. It's about containing the perceived threat of global communism. The conflict in Vietnam is now a proxy battle in the great ideological struggle between East and West. The Vietnamese people, fighting for their own national independence, are caught in the middle of a superpower chess match. The war drags on for years, a grueling affair of ambushes, jungle patrols, and bloody battles. The French control the cities and major roads, but the Viet Minh control the countryside and, more importantly, the hearts and minds of many peasants. The French public grows weary of a war that seems endless and unwinnable, a war they call a sale guerre, the dirty war. French commanders, desperate for a decisive victory to break the stalemate, devise a daring and ultimately fatal plan. In late 1953, they establish a massive, fortified airland base deep in enemy territory, in a valley called Yayan Bien Phaich. The French commander, General André Navarre, believes he can lure the Viet Minh's main force into a conventional, set-piece battle where superior French firepower will annihilate them. It's a classic European military strategy, a trap designed to crush the enemy once and for all. They see the Viet Minh as a peasant guerrilla army, incapable of mounting a major siege against a modern fortress. This assumption would prove to be one of the greatest military miscalculations of the 20th century. The Viet Minh commander, General V. Nguyen Inagwe, sees the French plan not as a trap, but as an opportunity. He accepts the challenge. In an incredible feat of logistics and human determination, tens of thousands of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers begin to haul heavy artillery, piece by piece, over mountains and through dense jungles, all by hand or on reinforced bicycles. They surround the French garrison, digging a complex network of trenches and tunnels that creep ever closer to the French lines. They place their cannons on the high ground overlooking the valley, something the French thought was impossible. On March 13th, 1954, the storm breaks. The Viet Minh unleash a devastating artillery barrage that shocks the French defenders. The airstrip, the garrison's only lifeline, is quickly destroyed. The French are trapped. The battle rages for 56 nightmarish days. It's a brutal, close-quarters fight in a landscape of mud, blood, and craters. The French fight bravely, but they are isolated, outnumbered, and relentlessly pounded by an enemy they had so dangerously underestimated. Desperate pleas for American air intervention, possibly even with tactical nuclear weapons, are considered in Washington but ultimately rejected. President Eisenhower is unwilling to commit American forces to save the French position. On May 7, 1954, the last French strongpoint at Dien Bien Phu falls. The Viet Minh have won a stunning, decisive victory. It's a victory that resonates around the world. A small Asian nationalist movement had defeated a major European colonial power in a conventional battle. It signals the end of French colonialism in Indochina and inspires anti-colonial movements across the globe. The very next day, a world away in Switzerland, the Geneva Conference convenes. The major powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, gather to settle the conflicts in Korea and Indochina. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu leaves France with no bargaining power. The resulting Geneva Accords are a compromise. They call for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of French forces. More significantly, they temporarily divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North, under the control of Ho Chi Minh, and the Communists, becomes the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The South, where the French had established a pro-Western state, becomes the state of Vietnam, soon to be the Republic of Vietnam under a new American-backed leader, Anh Gianech Diem. The division was meant to be temporary. The Accords explicitly stated that the dividing line was not a political or territorial boundary, and called for nationwide free elections to be held in 1956 to reunify the country. But those elections would never happen. The United States, fearing a near-certain victory for Ho Chi Minh, refuses to sign the Accords and immediately moves to build up South Vietnam as a permanent, anti-communist nation. The temporary dividing line at the 17th parallel hardens into a fortified border, a new front line in the Cold War. So, the First Indochina War ends, but peace does not come to Vietnam. Instead, the Geneva Accords merely set the stage for a new, larger, and even more tragic conflict. The seeds of the American war in Vietnam have been sown. The French have departed, but a new foreign power, the United States, is now deeply entangled, committed to defending a divided Vietnam and stopping communism at any cost. The struggle for Vietnam's soul is far from over. It is only just beginning. The Cold War was unjust fought with spies and nuclear threats in the capitals of Washington and Moscow. It was also fought in the rice paddies and jungles of a country half a world away. Vietnam, after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu and the Geneva Accords of 1954, Vietnam was split in two. In the north, Ho Chi Minh's communists held power. In the south, a new nation was born, and the United States was its primary architect and sponsor. This is the story of how America stepped in, transforming a regional conflict into its own national tragedy. This is Chapter 2. America steps in. Following the Geneva Accords, the United States threw its full support behind the newly formed government of South Vietnam, led by a staunch, anti-communist, nationalist, NHD. M.A. Washington's goal was clear: to build a stable, prosperous, and democratic South Vietnam that would serve as a bulwark against communist expansion in Southeast Asia. This was the domino theory in action. If South Vietnam fell, American policymakers believed Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and the rest of the region would inevitably follow. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was a firm believer in this. He saw South Vietnam as the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia. The mission was to prevent that first domino from tipping over. Initially, American aid was mostly economic and political. Washington poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Diem's regime, funding everything from infrastructure projects to government salaries. They sent political advisors to help shape the new government and train a civil service. The hope was to win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people, to show them that a non-communist path offered a better future. But from the very beginning, the project was built on shaky ground. Anh Diem was a complex and controversial figure. a devout Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country. He was an ardent nationalist who had opposed both the French and the Communists. The Americans saw him as the only viable non-communist leader available. But Diem was also autocratic, nepotistic, and deeply disconnected from the rural population. His government quickly became notorious for corruption. Power was concentrated in the hands of his family, particularly his brother, Ngganichnu, who ran the secret police with an iron fist, and Nu's wife, the formidable and outspoken Madame Nu. One of Diem's first major challenges was consolidating his power. In 1955, with CIA backing, he rigged a referendum to depose the former emperor, Boji, and declare himself president of the new Republic of Vietnam. He then ruthlessly crushed political rivals, including powerful religious sects and criminal organizations that had controlled parts of Saigon. While this brutality was seen by some in Washington as a necessary evil to establish order, it alienated large segments of the South Vietnamese population and sowed the seeds of future rebellion. Meanwhile, in the north, Hanoi was not sitting idle. While they had agreed to the division at Geneva, they never abandoned their goal of a unified, communist Vietnam. They began to support and direct a growing insurgency in the south. These southern insurgents, labeled the Viet Cong by the Diem government, were a mix of former Viet Minh fighters who had stayed behind, local recruits disillusioned with Diem's rule, and cadres sent down from the north. They used guerrilla tactics, terrorism, and political assassination to destabilize the Saigon government, particularly in the countryside, where Diem's authority was weakest. The Viet Cong were masters of propaganda and organization. They capitalized on the peasants' grievances, promising land reform and social justice, painting Diem as a puppet of American imperialists. They established a shadow government in many villages, collecting taxes and administering their own form of justice. For many rural Vietnamese, the Viet Cong seemed to offer a more appealing alternative than the distant, corrupt, and often oppressive officials from Saigon. The famous Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of jungle paths through Laos and Cambodia, became the vital artery for supplying the southern insurgency with weapons, supplies, and manpower from the north. As the insurgency grew, so did America's involvement. The nature of the aid began to shift from purely economic and political to military. Under Eisenhower, the first U.S. military advisors arrived. Their official mission was to train the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, or Army of the Republic of Vietnam. But they were training it to fight a conventional war, a repeat of the Korean conflict, with divisions and tanks. They weren't prepared for the shadowy guerrilla war being waged by the Viet Cong. The advisors were few in number, just a few hundred, and their role was strictly none. But the line was already beginning to blur. When John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, he inherited a worsening situation in Vietnam. Kennedy was a Cold War hawk, committed to bearing any burden to defend freedom. He and his team of the best and the brightest saw Vietnam as a critical test of American resolve against communist wars of national liberation. They dramatically increased the level of support. The number of military advisors skyrocketed from under 900 in 1961 to over 16,000. By the end of 1963, American pilots, flying in unmarked planes, began conducting bombing raids in support of ARVN operations. U.S. Special Forces, the Green Beret, were deployed to the Central Highlands to train local tribesmen to fight the Viet Cong. The Kennedy administration also pushed for new counterinsurgency strategies. The most ambitious of these was the Strategic Hamlet Program. The idea, based on a British model used in Malaya, was to isolate the rural population from the Viet Cong. Peasants were forcibly relocated from their ancestral villages into new, fortified hamlets, surrounded by barbed wire and moats. The government was supposed to provide security, schools, and medical care inside these hamlets, thus winning their loyalty. But in practice, the program was a disaster. It was implemented far too quickly and with great brutality. For many peasants, being forced from their homes and the graves of their ancestors was the ultimate insult. Instead of winning hearts and minds, the Strategic Hamlet Program often created more recruits for the Viet Cong. It was a perfect example of a Western solution completely misapplied to a Vietnamese context. By 1963, the situation was spiraling out of control. The South Vietnamese military was proving largely ineffective, plagued by poor leadership, low morale, and a reluctance to engage the enemy. The Viet Cong, on the other hand, were growing stronger and more daring. In January 1963, at the Battle of Ap Bac, a small contingent of Viet Cong fighters mauled a much larger, better-equipped ARVN force that was accompanied by American advisors. It was a humiliating defeat that exposed the deep flaws in the American-backed military strategy. The political situation was even worse. Diem's government had become increasingly repressive. The breaking point came with the Buddhist crisis of 1963, when the government banned the flying of Buddhist flags during a major religious festival. Peaceful protests erupted in the city of Hue. Government troops fired on the crowd, killing several people, including children. The incidents sparked a wave of outrage across the country. Buddhist monks began to lead massive anti-government demonstrations. In a shocking act of protest that was captured in an iconic, horrifying photograph, a monk named Tisich Quang Gisi publicly set himself on fire in a busy Saigon intersection. More self-immolations followed. The images were broadcast around the world, deeply damaging the reputation of the Diem regime and its American backers. Madame New's callous reaction, mockingly referring to the events as a barbecue, only added to the international condemnation. For the Kennedy administration, it was the final straw. Diem was no longer a viable partner. He had lost the support of his own people and was now an obstacle to winning the war. Behind the scenes, the U.S. government signaled to a group of dissident RVN generals that it would not oppose a coup. On November 1st, 1963, the generals made their move. They seized key installations in Saigon and surrounded the presidential palace. Diem and his brother Nhu escaped, but were captured and assassinated the next day. The United States was now complicit in the overthrow and murder of the very leader they had spent nearly a decade propping up. Washington had hoped the coup would bring in a more effective government that could rally the country and fight the communists. They were wrong. The removal of Diem plunged South Vietnam into a period of extreme political instability. A series of military juntas followed, none of which could command popular support or effectively govern. The Viet Cong took full advantage of the chaos in Saigon, rapidly expanding their control over the countryside. 3 weeks after the coup in Saigon, President Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, inherited a commitment to a country that was now in free fall. The limited partnership was over. The number of advisors was no longer enough. The strategy of supporting a local government to fight its own war had failed. America was trapped. To pull out now would be seen as a humiliating defeat, a betrayal of all the resources and lives already invested. The only path forward seemed to be deeper involvement. Advisors would soon become combat troops. Support would become an all-out American war. The stage was set for the next, and most brutal, chapter of the Vietnam War. If you want to watch the next chapters of the Vietnam War, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Whispering History Tales. Thanks for watching.